The engine didn't fail all at once. It unraveled. A soft knock, then silence, and the car kept rolling without resistance, heat flooding through the vents as if the desert had found a way inside, until gravel replaced asphalt, and the vehicle stopped, surrounded by glare and distance. And in that stillness he understood something was wrong, because the road behind him had already dissolved into shimmer. The road ahead looked identical, and direction no longer existed, only time slipping quietly out of reach. It was the summer of 1987. On a maintenance road few people remembered and fewer still used. Back when paper maps were trusted, engines were simple, and being unreachable felt normal, not dangerous. And Daniel Mercer carried that assumption with him as he opened the door. Daniel stayed inside the car longer than he needed to, because the shadow beneath the roof still existed, thin but defined, the last negotiable space between him and the desert. The temperature needle was buried past red. The hood clicked and popped as metal surrendered to heat, and when he finally stepped out, the air struck him with weight, not warmth, pressure that pushed against his chest and shortened each breath. The road was there in theory, pale gravel stretching between low ridges, but it felt unfinished, abandoned mid-thought. No signs, no mile markers, no tire tracks fresh enough to trust, and the horizon repeated itself in every direction, flat and blinding, making distance impossible to judge and movement feel optional. Risky. He lifted the hood knowing it wouldn't change anything. The steam was already gone. Coolant boiled away into nothing. The radiator split clean along the seam, quiet and final. And he stared longer than he should have, because acknowledging damage makes it permanent, and permanence in a place like this carried weight. The trunk offered little comfort. 2 plastic water bottles already warm, crackers sealed months ago, a tire iron, jumper cables that now felt mocking, no tarp, no flare, no radio. And in 1987 there was nothing else to check. No phone, no signal, no second opinion, just silence stretching outward. He told himself to wait, because waiting felt responsible, because staying with the car was what people said you should do, because moving meant commitment. But the sun was already dropping, stretching shadows that looked like paths and then collapsing them again. And far above, a jet crossed the sky, visible only as a thin white scar that faded before he could react. Then he noticed the ants, how quickly they gathered beneath the engine where a trace of moisture had touched the dirt. Immediate, efficient, purposeful. And the thought landed hard, that life out here didn't hesitate. It acted, quickly or not at all. He unfolded the map again, traced the line with his finger. 15 miles to a junction if the road existed as promised. Shorter if he cut straight across. The land deceptively flat. The math tempting. And as he closed the trunk, Daniel realized the first mistake hadn't been the broken radiator, but the belief that the desert would wait while he decided what to do next. Daniel started walking because standing still had begun to feel like wasting something precious. Not water yet, but momentum. And once momentum is gone, it's harder to rebuild than any engine. So he followed the road at first, slow and deliberate, keeping the car in sight longer than necessary, turning back twice just to confirm it was still real, still there, still an anchor he could return to if his thinking went wrong. After a mile, the gravel softened, edges blurring into sand, the road narrowing until it felt less like a route and more like a suggestion. And with every step, the heat climbed higher inside his skull. Not sharp, not dramatic, just steady and patient, the kind that doesn't announce danger until damage is already done. He rationed water immediately, 1 small swallow at measured intervals, even though thirst was already present, because thirst arrived early out here. A liar meant to rush you, and he refused to let urgency become panic. But his tongue was thick, his mouth dry enough to feel every breath scrape past it. The road bent slightly, and then the car vanished behind him, swallowed by distance and glare, and that moment carried more weight than it should have, because now there was no easy reversal, no quick retreat, only forward or sideways, both equally uncertain. He checked the map again, holding it low, tracing the line that was supposed to lead somewhere solid, a junction, a sign, proof. The world still worked the way he expected it to, but the map offered no scale for heat, no warning about how far 15 miles felt when every step pulled moisture from bone and muscle. A sound broke the stillness, a deep mechanical thrum, distant but real, and his heart reacted before his mind, accelerating, hope surging fast and dangerous. He turned slowly, scanning the horizon, hand raised instinctively, but the sound shifted, faded, resolved into aircraft noise moving laterally, not toward him, and then it was gone, leaving silence heavier than before. The ground betrayed him slightly, a misstep, loose gravel sliding underfoot, forcing him to catch himself, and the effort spiked his breathing more than it should have, pulse thudding in his ears, a subtle warning that exertion was becoming expensive. He slowed, counted steps, forced pauses, crouched in the shadow of a low rock that offered almost nothing but the illusion of relief. And in that stillness, he noticed how quiet his thoughts had become. Fewer options, fewer questions, just simple evaluations. Water level, direction, sun position, and that narrowing felt efficient and dangerous at the same time. The road ended without ceremony, dissolving into open desert. No sign, no junction, just flat land stretching out, identical in every direction. And Daniel stood there longer than he should have, turning slowly, trying to force the map to match the world. And in that moment, he understood the second mistake hadn't arrived as a decision, but as an assumption, that the road would lead somewhere simply because it was drawn that way. He chose a direction anyway, angling toward a low rise that promised perspective, telling himself height meant clarity. And as he started upward, he didn't notice how his steps had shortened, how his balance lagged a fraction behind intention, how the desert was beginning, very patiently, to take the lead. The rise looked closer than it was, the slope gentle enough to lie, and Daniel told himself he would stop halfway, just far enough to see, just enough elevation to orient himself. But the desert had a way of stretching promises, of moving finish lines without announcing it. And by the time he realized how far he'd come, turning back felt heavier than continuing. His breathing had changed without asking permission, shallow and frequent, each inhale dry and unsatisfying, as if the air no longer carried what it was supposed to. Sweat stopped forming altogether, replaced by a tight heat under his skin. And that absence should have frightened him more than it did. But fear required energy, and energy was becoming something to manage. At the top, the view offered nothing useful, no junction, no ribbon of road, no structure breaking the horizon, just more desert unfolding in every direction, layered and identical. And for the first time, a thin thread of anger cut through the fog, not panic yet, but irritation, sharp and irrational, aimed at the map, at the road, at himself for trusting lines drawn by someone who would never stand here. He checked the sun again, lower now, its color shifting toward orange, shadows stretching longer but not cooler, and he did the math he'd been avoiding. Water remaining, distance unknown. The car now hidden completely, not even a glint of metal to guide him back. And that realization landed harder than thirst, because it closed a door he hadn't meant to shut. Daniel took another swallow of water, larger than planned, because his hands were shaking slightly and precision felt optional, and the water tasted wrong now, flat and warm, offering no relief, just the brief illusion of it. And when he capped the bottle, he noticed his fingers didn't quite line up with the threads the first time. He laughed once, quietly, at nothing, the sound thin and unfamiliar, and that should have been another warning. But instead, it felt grounding, proof he was still thinking, still present, still himself, even as his thoughts began looping, circling the same options without progress, forward or sideways, shade or distance, wait or move. The ground ahead shimmered, not mirage exactly, but something close enough to confuse the eye, a pale band that looked smoother, darker, almost like a road. And hope returned fast and unearned, because hope out here was dangerous. It sped you up when slowing down was survival, and Daniel found himself walking faster without deciding to. His foot caught again, harder this time, sending him down onto one knee, gravel biting through fabric, pain sharp and immediate, and he stayed there longer than necessary, palms pressed into hot stone, because standing required effort and effort demanded water. And for a moment the idea of staying exactly where he was felt reasonable. When he pushed himself up, the world tilted slightly, corrected itself, then tilted again, slower this time, and he stood still, waiting for it to pass, counting breaths, forcing calm. But the horizon wouldn't settle, edges softening, depth flattening, distance losing meaning. He thought of the car then, vividly. The smell of old upholstery, the quiet tick of cooling metal, the shade that had felt negotiable, and the thought carried a sudden, sharp clarity. Not regret, but understanding. That leaving it had not been wrong, but leaving it without marking direction, without fixing a return, had cost him more than time. The light was fading faster now, the desert cooling in theory but not yet in practice, and Daniel realized he was running out of clean choices. Only compromises remained, each one carrying a cost he could no longer calculate accurately. And as he took another step toward the shimmering ground ahead, he didn't notice that his sense of urgency had overtaken his judgment, or that the desert, quiet and patient, had already begun closing the distance between decision and consequence. The shimmer ahead collapsed as he reached it, not into a road or shade, but into ordinary ground that looked no different from what he'd already crossed, and the disappointment hit harder than he expected. Sharp and disorienting, because it meant his mind had started lying to him. Not dramatically, not in obvious ways, but subtly, adjusting reality to make movement feel justified. Daniel stopped again, longer this time, hands on his knees, breathing shallow and fast, his heartbeat loud enough to hear, and when he straightened, the horizon swayed, just slightly, like something seen through water, forcing him to widen his stance to keep balance, an instinctive correction that came a second later than it should have. The heat was changing now, no longer a steady pressure, but something uneven, pulses of warmth followed by brief chills that made no sense, goosebumps rising on his arms even as sweat refused to return. His skin dry and tight, stretched too thin over muscle and bone, and that contradiction should have scared him. But fear required clarity, and clarity was thinning. He checked the bottle again, surprised by how light it felt, tilted it, listened to the small remaining slosh, did the math poorly, told himself it was enough, told himself many things lately, and each reassurance felt less solid than the last. Words stacking without weight. The sky was shifting color, orange deepening toward red, shadows lengthening into something almost solid, and for the first time the idea of night arrived not as relief, but as threat, because darkness meant cold, disorientation, and no chance of correcting mistakes made under heat, only enduring them. He considered stopping, really stopping, sitting down and waiting for night, conserving energy, conserving water. But the ground radiated heat like a held breath, and the thought of lying against it made his skin crawl. So instead, he kept moving, not because it was right, but because stillness had begun to feel like surrender. A sound reached him then, faint and irregular, not mechanical, not wind, something softer, a scraping, intermittent and distant, and his head lifted instinctively, hope flaring again before reason could intervene. He turned slowly, scanning, listening harder than his body wanted to, and the sound repeated, closer this time, resolving into nothing identifiable, just movement somewhere it shouldn't be. "Hello," he called, the word dry and rough in his throat, disappearing almost immediately, swallowed by open space, and when nothing answered, irritation surged again, sharp and misplaced, anger at the silence itself, at the desert's refusal to acknowledge effort. His foot dragged unexpectedly, not a stumble, just a delay, muscle lagging behind intention, And that was new, that was wrong. He forced his stride longer, exaggerated motion to compensate, and the correction worked, barely, but it cost him. Breath coming faster, vision narrowing slightly at the edges. He noticed then how quiet his thoughts had become. Not calm, but sparse. Long gaps between ideas, moments where nothing formed at all, and in those gaps his body kept moving on its own, one step after another. Direction chosen earlier and now followed without question. The light was fading fast, the temperature finally beginning to drop. Not enough to help, just enough to confuse. And Daniel realized he was running out of daylight without having secured anything in return. No shelter, no landmark, no plan that survived scrutiny. And that understanding arrived with a sudden, hollow clarity. He stopped again, turned in a slow circle, trying to memorize the world before it changed completely. But every angle looked the same, and as darkness crept in, he felt something settle over him. Not panic, not yet, but a heavy, unwelcome certainty that the desert had been patient long enough, and whatever choice he made next would matter more than all the ones before it. Night didn't fall. It erased. Color drained first, then depth, then the last reliable edges of the world. And Daniel understood two peas know how quickly the desert reclaimed everything once the sun was gone. The horizon folding inward, distance collapsing, direction turning into guesswork. The ground released its heat unevenly, warm patches giving way to sudden cold, his skin prickling, muscles tightening without rhythm, and he wrapped his arms around himself not for comfort, but orientation, reminding his body where it ended, because the dark made everything feel unfinished. He stopped walking because risk had shifted. Night hid rocks, fractures, shallow drops the day had revealed, and a broken ankle would end everything quietly and completely. So stillness became strategy, not surrender, and he stood listening, waiting for sound to give him what sight no longer could. Nothing answered, no insects, no wind, no distant engines, only silence so complete it felt intentional, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. Daniel lowered himself beside a low rock outcrop, the stone still warm against his palms, and when he sat the fatigue arrived all at once, heavy and abrupt, his head dipping forward before he caught it, eyes closing for a fraction of a second too long. Sleep reached for him immediately, thick and persuasive, promising relief. And that scared him enough to force his eyes open, because somewhere beneath the fog, he knew that sleeping now, dehydrated and exposed, wasn't rest. It was negotiation, and the desert never bargained. He checked his supplies again, slower now. The bottle nearly empty, crackers untouched but meaningless, the map useless in the dark. And his fingers fumbled as he folded it away, clumsy, imprecise, paper slipping twice before he managed to hold it. Then a sound, close enough to matter, a soft crunch, irregular, followed by another, his head snapping up, heart hammering hard enough to hurt, adrenaline cutting briefly through the haze. He held his breath, listening, counting seconds. The sound came again, closer. "Hey!" he called. Louder than before, the word cracking halfway out, swallowed instantly by the dark, and the sound stopped, replaced by nothing, the silence afterward heavier than before. Fear arrived fully then, not abstract, not distant, but immediate and physical, tightening his chest, sharpening every sensation, because now it wasn't just the environment, it was the unknown within it. Minutes stretched without shape, time losing structure, and slowly his breathing settled again, fear draining just enough to leave exhaustion behind, and with it a cold realization surfaced, clear and unavoidable. This night wasn't a pause, it was the test. Daniel pressed his back against the rock, staring into the dark to stay awake, knowing that whatever condition the sun found him in would decide whether there was anything left to save. The night stretched, elastic and shapeless, minutes losing their edges, hours refusing to announce themselves, and Daniel stayed awake by force rather than will, blinking hard, shifting his weight, pressing his nails into his palm whenever his head dipped, because every time his eyes closed, the dark seemed to lean closer. Cold crept in unevenly, first at his feet, then along his calves, a thin, invasive numbness that made movement feel optional, and he told himself to keep flexing his toes, to keep blood moving, to stay present. But the commands arrived slower now, delayed somewhere between thought and action. His mouth felt swollen, tongue thick, lips cracked enough to sting when he breathed, and he lifted the bottle, shaking it gently, listening to the faintest slosh, the sound smaller than he expected, smaller than he wanted, and he took a sip anyway, not because it was efficient, but because the act itself grounded him, even as the water offered no relief. The darkness played tricks, shadows shifting without cause, shapes forming at the edge of vision and dissolving when he turned his head. And each time it happened, his heart jumped, adrenaline flaring and fading too fast, leaving him more tired than before. At some point the sound returned, closer now, unmistakable. A slow, deliberate crunch, pause, another crunch. And Daniel froze. Breath caught halfway in, listening hard enough it hurt. The sound circling, not approaching directly, and his mind filled the gaps with possibilities he didn't want. "Hello," he said again, quieter this time, conserving effort, the words scraping out of him and vanishing. And when nothing answered, he felt anger rise, sharp and irrational. Anger at the dark, at the sound, at the part of himself that still hoped. He considered standing, then rejected it. Standing wasted energy. Standing invited mistakes. And instead, he shifted closer to the rock, curling inward, making himself smaller, a primitive instinct asserting itself without explanation. Thoughts began to slip then, not vanish, just disconnect. Ideas arriving without sequence, memories intruding without context, the smell of coolant, the feel of the steering wheel, the sound of the engine sighing into silence. And he had to work to pull himself back, to remember where he was, why he was here, what mattered next. Time blurred further, and somewhere in that blur the sound stopped completely, replaced by nothing. And that absence felt worse, because it removed the one external marker he had been using to prove the night was still moving forward. When the sky finally began to change, it was subtle, not light yet, just less dark, a thinning at the edges, and Daniel noticed it late, his eyes slow to adjust, his thoughts slower, but the realization landed with fragile relief. Morning was coming, whether he was ready for it or not. He pressed his hands into the ground, testing strength, surprised by how weak they felt, how effort now required negotiation, and as he waited for enough light to move safely, Daniel understood that surviving the night had cost him more than he could measure yet, and whatever choices came next would be made by a version of himself already diminished. The light returned slowly, not as sunrise but as permission, the black thinning into gray, shapes separating just enough to be recognized. And Daniel waited until he could see the ground clearly before he moved, because a fall now would cost more than it ever had. When he pushed himself upright, his legs protested immediately, stiff and uncooperative, joints slow to answer commands, and he stood still for a long moment, letting the dizziness pass, letting the world settle into something stable, or close enough to trust. The desert looked different in the morning, not kinder, just exposed, every mistake visible, every mile laid bare. And from where he stood there was still no sign of a road, no structure, no landmark worth the name, only low rises and shallow cuts that all looked equally possible and equally wrong. His mouth was past dry now. It felt padded, distant, his tongue slow and heavy, and when he lifted the bottle again there was almost nothing left, one swallow at best. And he hesitated longer than he should have, because this wasn't thirst anymore. This was budgeting. He drank anyway, a single careful mouthful, holding it before swallowing, trying to trick his body into believing it was more than it was. And when it was gone, the bottle felt useless in his hand. Too light, too final. Movement felt necessary again. The cold of night already lifting, the promise of heat returning, And Daniel chose a direction not because it was better, but because it was slightly downhill. Because gravity suggested drainage. Because drainage suggested something once moved through there. As he walked, his pace slowed without permission, steps shortening, footfalls uneven, and he caught himself drifting slightly left, then correcting, then drifting again, and that frightened him more than the dark had, because it meant his body was making decisions before he could approve them. The sun cleared the horizon quickly, light hardening, shadows shrinking, and with it came heat, faster than expected, pressing in from above and below. And Daniel felt the familiar pressure return behind his eyes, a dull pulse that made thinking feel like pushing through resistance. He stopped again, shaded his eyes, scanned the land, and for a moment he thought he saw something, a straight line cutting across the desert, darker than the ground around it, and hope surged automatically, dangerously, pulling him forward before logic could catch up. Halfway there, his vision narrowed, edges dimming, sound dropping away, as if someone had closed a door, and he staggered, catching himself with a sharp inhale, heart racing too fast, too hard, and he stayed still until the world widened again. The line ahead dissolved as he focused on it, resolving into nothing more than a change in color, and the disappointment hit deep, hollowing him out, because it confirmed what he had been avoiding. His mind was no longer reliable. Daniel lowered himself to the ground again, not sitting so much as collapsing, palms burning against hot sand, breath shallow and rapid, and as he stared at the dirt inches from his face, he understood that the danger had shifted again. This wasn't about distance now. It was about time, and time was no longer moving at a pace he could control. He stayed on the ground longer than he intended, not resting but negotiating, waiting for his breathing to slow, for the pressure behind his eyes to ease, and when he pushed himself up again, it felt like lifting someone else's body, limbs heavy, coordination delayed, the simple act of standing demanding concentration. Heat was already winning back the hours it had lost. The sun higher now, sharper, the ground reflecting it upward so it pressed from both sides, and Daniel realized he had made it through the night only to enter the more dangerous half of the day, when mistakes happened faster and recovery took longer. He forced himself to move again, not straight, not confidently, but forward enough to avoid stopping completely, because stopping invited thoughts he couldn't afford. Thoughts about how far he'd come, how little he'd gained, how empty the bottle felt even swinging at his side. His vision fluttered intermittently, brief moments where the world dimmed and returned, like a faulty switch. And each time it happened, his steps slowed, then sped up, an unconscious correction that burned more energy than steady movement ever would. He tried to think clearly, tried to plan, but ideas arrived broken, incomplete, starting strong and dissolving halfway through, and he caught himself repeating the same checks, sun position, direction of slope, condition of his hands, as if cycling through them would produce something new. A breeze touched his face suddenly, light but unmistakable, and he froze, lifting his head, hope flaring despite everything, because breeze meant change, meant terrain, meant something different ahead, and he turned toward it without fully deciding to. The breeze faded as quickly as it came, leaving only heat and disappointment, and Daniel laughed again, short and dry, the sound surprising him, because it didn't match how close he felt to the edge. His legs began to cramp then, first a tightening in the calves, then a sharp pull behind one knee that forced him to stop mid-step, pain flashing bright and sudden, and he stood there breathing through it, knowing cramps meant dehydration had crossed another line. He lowered himself slowly, stretching his leg out in front of him, hands shaking as he massaged the muscle, skin hot and dry, no sweat left to give, and as the cramp eased it left behind weakness, a fragile sense that the system was failing in small, irreversible ways. He looked around again, desperate now, scanning not for roads or buildings but for shade, any break in the sun, a rock large enough to matter, a depression deep enough to hide in, and the land offered almost nothing, just shallow rises and scattered stones that promised less than they delivered. Daniel moved toward the nearest one anyway, dragging his feet slightly because effort was becoming expensive and precision harder to maintain. And as he settled into the thin shadow it provided, barely cooler than standing, he understood that his margin was gone. There would be no dramatic collapse, no clear moment of failure, just a narrowing tunnel of options closing quietly, and somewhere inside that tunnel he would have to decide whether to keep moving blindly or stop and hope the desert made a mistake before he did. The shade barely existed, a thin wavering line that shifted as the sun climbed, and Daniel tracked it with small movements, sliding inches at a time, conserving effort, conserving breath, because even lifting his head felt costly now, like drawing from a reserve that didn't refill. Heat pressed in from every direction, not just above but below, the ground radiating it back into him, and he felt strangely detached from the sensation, aware of it without reacting properly, as if pain had decided it was no longer worth announcing itself. His thoughts thinned again, stretched out, long pauses between them, and when ideas did arrive they came out of order, fragments without edges, the sound of the engine dying, the feel of the steering wheel, the certainty he'd had then that things could still be fixed, and each memory arrived sharper than the present. He tried to stand, failed halfway, knees buckling slightly, forcing him to catch himself with one hand, the effort sending a brief spark of panic through him, because falling meant impact, and impact meant injury, and injury meant the end of decisions. He stayed kneeling, breathing shallow and fast, vision tunneling again, edges dimming, a ringing starting somewhere deep in his ears, and he pressed his forehead to the sand, not in defeat, but to block the light, to reduce the input, to give his mind less to fight. Time slipped again, minutes or longer, he couldn't tell, the sun moving without reference, the shadow shrinking until it disappeared completely, leaving him exposed, and that disappearance felt final in a way nothing else had yet. A sound reached him then, distant but distinct, not imagined this time, a low mechanical hum, steady, persistent, and his head lifted slowly, heart stuttering, hope flaring despite everything he knew, because hope didn't wait for permission. The sound grew clearer, resolving into an engine, far away but real, moving laterally across the desert, not directly toward him, and he pushed himself upright again, swaying, forcing his arms above his head, waving weakly, shouting though the word barely formed, his voice breaking before it carried. The engine didn't change course. The sound passed, faded, thinned into nothing, and the silence that followed hit harder than any blow, because it confirmed what he had been avoiding, that even when help existed, it didn't necessarily see you, didn't necessarily stop. Daniel sank back down, movement slower now, heavier, and with the disappointment came a dangerous calm, a softness at the edges of fear, the kind that made giving up feel reasonable, even logical, because continuing required energy he could no longer guarantee. He thought about lying down fully, about closing his eyes just for a moment, about letting the heat do what it was already doing anyway, and the thought felt comforting, seductive, almost kind. That was when something shifted inside him. Not strength, not resolve, but stubbornness, thin and sharp, the refusal to let the last decision be an easy one. He rolled onto his side, then onto his back, forcing himself to look at the sky, at the hard, empty blue, blinking against the light, because staying conscious had become the task now, not movement, not distance. Whatever happened next would happen soon, and he needed to be awake for it. The sky stayed empty longer than it should have. A hard blue stretched too wide and too clean, and Daniel lay staring into it, blinking on purpose, counting each blink to stay anchored, because slipping now felt easy, like loosening fingers from a rope you had held for too long. His breathing had slowed, not from calm, but from efficiency, shallow pulls of air that barely moved his chest, and with distant curiosity he noticed his heartbeat no longer raced. It drifted, uneven and soft, like something winding down instead of fighting. The ground burned where it touched him. heat seeping through fabric and skin, and he shifted once, a small movement that cost more than it should have, muscles protesting, joints stiff, and after that he stayed still because pain at least meant sensation still existed. Then a shadow crossed his face, not slow like a cloud, not wide like dusk, but sharp and brief, something passing overhead, and his eyes snapped shut on reflex, then opened again, squinting hard, heart stuttering as adrenaline tried to wake systems already running on empty. The sound followed a second later, unmistakable now, rotor wash chopping the air, uneven and loud, the ground trembling faintly beneath him, and hope surged so fast it made him dizzy, because hope this late felt violent, dangerous. He tried to sit up, failed, arms shaking uselessly, fingers digging into sand that offered no leverage, panic flaring sharp and humiliating, fear not of dying but of being seen too late, of being present but unable to respond. The helicopter shifted away, the sound changing angle, not fading yet but moving, and Daniel forced himself to scream, the effort tearing at his throat, the sound coming out wrong, thin and broken, swallowed by distance and engine noise. He tore at his shirt, movements clumsy and delayed, fabric resisting more than it should have, and when it finally came free, he waved it weakly above his chest, arms burning, vision narrowing again, the world pulsing at the edges. The sound hesitated, subtle at first, the engine pitch changing slightly. Then the shadow returned. Longer now, slower, passing over him again, and Daniel laughed once, cracked and breathless, the sound surprising him. He kept waving even as strength drained from his shoulders, even as his hands shook uncontrollably, because stopping now felt impossible, like letting go inches from solid ground. Dust exploded nearby, hot and sudden, filling his mouth and eyes, and he squeezed them shut, coughing weakly, the noise overwhelming, close enough to feel inside his chest. When he opened them again, the world was chaos, air torn apart by sound and motion, a figure moving through dust, blurred but real, and Daniel fought to stay present, to not drift away at the moment it finally mattered. Hands reached him, firm and solid, gripping his shoulders, a voice shouting words he couldn't separate, and as he was lifted, the ground dropping away beneath him, one clear thought surfaced through the haze. He hadn't survived by being strong. He had survived by staying awake long enough to be found. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to read more survival stories.